Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Paul Sparrow, the author of Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh and the Battle to Save Democracy. This is his first book, and he is the former director of the FDR Library and Museum, which is an amazing place. I've been there. It's so awesome. It's a must visit. Mr. Sparrow, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that supports children's literacy. Paul Sparrow comes right out of the gate in his preface. He says, of all the presidents, FDR had the biggest impact. Not George Washington by giving up power and setting that precedent. Not Abraham Lincoln by steering the country through the Civil War and fighting for the 13th Amendment. Not FDR's big cousin Teddy with his preservation of public land. Rather, it is FDR who, Sparrow says, transformed the government's role in our lives and fought for democracy with that most powerful of tools, his words. So, Paul, are you biased because you ran the FDR library, or should all of us really flip the common belief on its head that Lincoln was the greatest of all?
Mea culpa, I'm guilty of a bias towards FDR. Part of my decision to claim that he had the biggest impact on American society and indeed on world history was the fact that he served for 12 years. You know, he was elected 4 times. Obviously, his didn't serve much of his 4th term, but he also was the steward of the great American experiment through 2 of the most extraordinary crises in American history, the Great Depression and then World War II. And it's interesting, his relationship with Washington and Lincoln, he frequently quotes from them and references them in his speeches. And there's several in the book that detail exactly why, particularly the 3rd inaugural address in 1941, why he goes back to them. And he specifically says, you know, Washington was the person who created America. Lincoln was the person who protected it from enemies within, who sought to mend the rift that had divided our country and brought the country together. And FDR saw his challenge as defending America from outside oppressors, Hitler and the rise of totalitarianism. So he saw himself as part of that. And I think almost every historical analysis, all the historian surveys rank Washington and Lincoln and FDR as the top 3. And you could certainly say, you know, 18th, 19th, 20th century leaders, they were the tops in their centuries. But I think in terms of longevity and impact, both on the United States, revamping the U.S. government, and in the world, the creation of the United Nations and the NATO alliance and all of those things that have created the world we live in today, it's pretty hard to argue FDR didn't change everything.
I never thought of that framing. The 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, each one in each century. Very interesting, very cool. Awakening the Spirit of America is your subtitle. What was or what is the spirit you're referring to, and why was it dormant?
It's so interesting because FDR was constantly trying to convince the American public that they had a higher calling. As he said in the 1936 convention when he accepted the nomination, that this generation has a rendezvous with destiny. And even when he said that, he didn't fully understand what it meant. I mean, he knew that there had been this global crisis of the Depression and that America was on the verge of sort of emerging from it. But more importantly, his view of the world, the global situation, he saw what was coming. He understood from a very early moment in history the threat that Adolf Hitler and Nazism posed democracy all over the world. And so what he was trying to do, America was so isolationist in this period. They had suffered through the Depression. They were still suffering in the Depression. 25% of Americans were unemployed. People were living on the street. People were literally starving. I mean, when you hear about food banks and bread banks, that was because they had no place else to go to eat. The government took no responsibility in helping those people who were desperate, and he changed that. But I think that his idea of the spirited America that he actually talks about in one of the chapters is that Americans' core belief is that it is worthy to fight for freedom. They took on the most powerful nation in the world, a bunch of ragtag farmers, right, and merchants with no navy, no army, no armaments industry, and they took on the British Empire because the core belief in America is that it's worth fighting for your freedom. And he saw this in the world. Rather than Americans stepping up and defending democracy and getting involved and engaging with the fascisms in Europe and the Japanese empire and its imperialistic totalitarian goals, Americans wanted to turn their back. They wanted nothing to do with it. And so he knew that before he could get the public support for America to get involved in these wars, which he knew it inevitably would, he had to convince them to look in for their better angels, to look in and understand what it means to be an American, and that this fight for freedom is essential to our very definition. It is, in his mind, the soul of America.
Boy, I tell you, I'm ready to go to war after you fight, after you said all that. You say that when you first became the head of the FDR library, that you were familiar with the big themes of FDR's life, the commonly accepted ones, and that your understanding of him changed over time as you worked at the library. Before we get to that change, though, explain what the so-called simpleton view that you and others may still have, you had and others still have of FDR.
Well, basically, the narrative is that the Great Depression made Herbert Hoover unelectable, and FDR sort of stumbled into the presidency at that moment. That he had overcome polio, he had great charisma. He may have been a little shallow, but he was a charming, leader, and that he came in and then was able to revamp the government and change the way the government supported the common man, the laborer, the unions, not just big business, to enable Americans to survive the Great Depression. And then when war broke out, he was the great Allied commander, single-handedly winning World War II. Now, obviously, the story is much more complicated than that.
That's a nice, neat story you told.
Right. And those are the two sort of pillars of his presidency. And it's important to understand, American history is that, some white guys came and took over the land. They didn't like the King of England, so there was a revolution, and then there was a Civil War, and then there was World War II, and then Vietnam, and now everything's great. And history is a lot more complicated.
Just a hair. I think it's really interesting to me that FDR and then later in the century JFK become sort of voices for common people. I'm really curious, and even though both of them were elite growing up in different ways, I've always wondered and I've always thought about how both of their experiences and brushes with death, how much that impacted their understanding of what regular people go through. I believe, I'm not necessarily a professional historian, but I believe that had a really big impact on both of their views of helping people in need. Do you agree with that FDR's unbelievably devastating illness had an impact?
There's no question. FDR's polio transformed him in many ways. And it's open to debate within the historical community how much it affected him. But, his image, certainly in the early days when he first got into politics in the New York State legislature, he was considered, a wiffle puff. He was charming and good looking and sort of hail fellow, well met. He came from a rich family. His mom, funded his campaigns. And he wasn't really taken that seriously. He got a reputation as being a great reformer for challenging Tammany and the corrupt Democratic Party, but really he was not particularly effective. He didn't really do much in Albany. And then, of course, he gets elevated to the point where he's the vice presidential candidate in 1920 after serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, sort of a meteoric rise during the Wilson administration. And he is poised. The Democrats get, shellacked in the 1920 election, but he is poised to be, the Democratic front runner for the 1924 election. And then in 1921, of course, he's struck down with polio at the sort of height of his political arc. And so there's two things that happened during his recovery from polio. One is that he went out in the wilderness, lived on a houseboat, basically sort of in many ways withdrew from society. He had a job. He sort of maintained a basic facade, but he didn't really engage. And he discovered Warm Springs, Georgia, which was a rundown resort in the red clay area of Western Georgia. And he decided he was going to transform it into this premier polio rehabilitation center. And so, although polio humbled him in many ways, I believe it was his experience as Doc Roosevelt, for 4 years in Georgia, dealing with these patients, having them come in desperate and broken, and helping them to recover. That's what really taught him the humanity, gave him such great empathy for the person who was suffering, for the person who had nothing. And of course, that area there is so poor back then. I mean, the tenant farmers and the sharecroppers, 8 people in a family living in a literal tar paper shack, barely able to grow enough food to pay their bills and feed their children. And I think he really realized that this was a neglected part of American society that needed assistance. They would never be able to break that cycle of poverty without help from the outside. And then, of course, you can never underestimate the influence of Eleanor Roosevelt. Right from when they first started dating in 1903 all the way through to the end of his life, she was the conscience. She was the one who helped him see the world through different eyes. Now, they both came from extraordinary privilege. I mean, Eleanor's uncle was the president of the United States when they got married. So
That's keep it in the family, right?
Right. Let's keep it in the
right.
family. So you have to, the extraordinary level of privilege that they were born into was something that they both overcame. I think Eleanor's arc in many ways is more interesting than FDR's, but you cannot deny for 1 second the influence that Eleanor had in this transformation of Franklin from a fairly self-absorbed, trust fund baby, essentially, to the president of the United States who really transformed government to help what he called the forgotten man.
You say that FDR became Hitler's key nemesis, the main stalwart against fascism, that democracy quite simply rested on FDR's shoulders. I'm really curious a little bit more about the early life, though. What early clues can we find in that early life that made him not only a believer in democracy, but made him strong enough in his personality to take that belief in democracy and take it to the next level as a public leader? What happened early in his life that you think made him ready for that kind of, dare I say, activism?
It's a great question. And there is a long list of historians who have tried to answer that question, and none have. Because there is no simple answer to that question. Certainly his father, instilled in him a sense of duty, that he should serve and do things that help society, but from the perspective of an elite, member of one of America's great families, right? And again, Eleanor had a tremendous influence on him. When they first started dating, one of the things she did was she took him to a settlement house in the slums of Manhattan where she was working, and he was just stunned that people could be living into those conditions. So that helped transform him. I think the moment that a number of people talk about is that when he's recovering from polio and he's at his mother's estate, Springwood in Hyde Park, and there's a big division in his camp. His mother, Sarah, wants him to just withdraw from society, be, disabled, become a gentleman farmer, live off their life. They have plenty of money. And Eleanor and Louis Howe, who was his sort of political guru, absolutely wanted him to continue his political career, which seemed crazy at the time. But he felt that he could never resume politics unless he could walk or pretend to walk. And he would try to walk the length of this long driveway. If you've
I
ever been
remember. Yeah,
to
I remember the
Springwood,
tour guide. Yep.
there's a long driveway, tree-lined driveway that goes out to the Albany Post Road. And he tried and tried and tried to be able to walk out there using crutches and supporting himself. And it was exhausting and painful and absolutely crushing. And he never really accomplished it. But it gave him this determination, and it made him strong in his ability to say, I am not going to let this stop me. And then, of course, there's the great scene in 1924, so he's basically, living on a houseboat, not doing much. And his mentor, Al Smith, who's the governor of New York, calls him and says, basically, I want you to put my name in nomination for presidency at the Democratic Convention. Now, FDR has been completely off the scene since polio hit him in 1921. And at first he says, no, I can't possibly do it. And then finally he agrees. So this is going to be his coming out. But he's going to have to walk, quote unquote, from backstage out to the podium to address the convention. And so he practices and learns how to do this sort of fake walk where he throws one leg in front of the other with steel braces on and holds on to his son's arm and grabs onto the podium when he gets there. And it's a moment where everybody who knew anything about him knew that this was it. This was, if he can get out to the podium and make this speech, he is back on track. And if he falls or in any way fails at that moment, his political career is over. And he did it, and he pulled it off. And of course, this is the great Happy Warrior speech where he talks about Al Smith as the Happy Warrior. But of course, the speech is really about himself. And if you go back and read, if you go back and read it, you realize he's quoting a poem, but of course, he's really talking about himself. And
is that the speech? Is that the speech at the end of it where he looked at his son and said, I did it. I did it. I remember a quote. That is it. Okay.
Yes. That's the moment when he comes out. And then, of course, he goes, he discovers Warm Springs right after that moment. So he goes down to Georgia to see this rundown resort that Endicott Peabody had said, you should go check this out. And sort of the next 4 years he spends, down there in rehabilitation when Al Smith calls him again and says, hey, I want you to run for governor of New York. I'm going to run for president again. And that's the decision moment for him because he's happy. He's found a calling. He's helping these people. He's making a real difference in people's lives. And yet there's this greater calling, the idea that he could be president of the United States, that he could change the world. And he accepts that challenge and, of course, goes on to become governor and then president.
While FDR was Hitler's nemesis, Charles Lindbergh was FDR's nemesis, at least in some areas. I don't know that you have to do a full introduction of Charles Lindbergh, but explain how this famous aviator goes from flying planes to political commentator.
Yeah, so in 1927, Lindbergh is an unknown airplane mechanic, basically, who flies across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris, solo, and becomes an instant global celebrity. I mean, it is very hard when you read about the events and what happened to him to understand how big a celebrity he was. You can make the case that he was the most famous man in the world. And that, for example, 6 months later, he flies into Mexico City as part of a tour of Central and South America. And 150,000 people show up at the airport outside Mexico City, and many of them spending the night sleeping on the ground so they have a good spot. The president, and the entire Mexican government is there to greet him. That gives you just some sense. His father had actually been one of the few congressmen who voted against America's entry into World War I. And so he was a pacifist. And after Lindbergh's young son was kidnapped and murdered, the press sort of hounded Lindbergh, and he and his wife ended up fleeing and living in England for several years and being in Europe, basically from 1935 until 1939. And during that time, he, again, super famous. So the German government invites him to come over and look and tour their aircraft facilities and fly their planes. And he becomes deeply enthralled by the German innovations and the German dynamism, as he called it. And he was disgusted by the sloth and decadence of the British Empire in its, fading glory. And of course, he's awarded this German Eagle Cross by the second most powerful man in Germany, had direct orders from Hitler. And that German cross that he's given sort of becomes this albatross, as his wife calls it, because he never denied it or turned it back or anything else, even after the horrors of the war came out later on. And so he had this real affinity for Germany. And when the war starts, Lindbergh basically comes out and says, we shouldn't support either side. It's wrong for America to get involved. We must remain neutral. And that when he's pressed during a congressional hearing about, well, which side do you want to see win? And remember, at this point, Germany has been a brutal oppressor, destroying countries, killing people, bombing civilians. He says neither side should win. I won't take sides. And so that's the point at which he launches his campaign to try to prevent FDR from being reelected in 1940, and becomes the voice of the isolationist movement.
How did FDR engage with Lindbergh? He makes public statements, Lindbergh does, about staying out of the war and even opposing military help for the British. At what point does FDR realize this is a threat to the goals that I have as president?
Well, they knew right from the very beginning. As a matter of fact, before his first radio address, so when Lindbergh had been in Germany, he was passing on all the information that he got from visiting the German factories and flying the German planes. He was passing it on to the U.S. military attaché at the embassy in Berlin, and he became good friends with the attaché. And then when he comes back to the United States in 1939, that attaché is now the aide de camp to General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. And so they find out that Lindbergh has asked for this radio time, and they send a message to him through this former military attaché that if he will not criticize FDR's policies and not come out as an isolationist, they will essentially make him Secretary of the Air Force. And Lindbergh says, I'm going to say what I'm going to say, and goes on and blasts it. So they knew right from his first public utterance that he was going to be a problem.
Before we get back to the narrative here, I want to ask, or before we continue with the narrative here, I want to ask a couple of questions just about the sources. And I have to ask, 17 million pages, 10,000 pieces of art, 25,000 artifacts, 50,000 books. Now, it sounds like you've got a lot of them crammed right up there in your head. How did you even begin to make sense of all that?
Well, there's a process that happens when you are immersed in a narrative like that. I had been a news producer and news broadcaster. I had been documentary filmmaker. I'd worked at museums on the history of journalism. So I'd been deeply immersed in history. So I had a lot of the framework already in place. And I am a natural storyteller and a quick study. But what happened when I got there to the library, because I was the director, I had sort of unfettered access to the archives, to the stacks, and to all these things. And of course, I drove the staff crazy, because the directors aren't supposed to do that. They're not supposed to walk around and look at stuff. Right. And every time I would go up into the stacks, the security would call the deputy director and say, Paul's up in the stacks again, because I would find things that I thought would be of interest to the public, because all of that material belongs to the public, right? FDR, the reason he's the first presidential library, even though there's other private libraries that were the possessions of presidents, he gave it all to the American public. And so as I got deeper and deeper into the story, there were certain things that I just couldn't understand, like his first fireside chat, 8 days into the job, after they've closed all the banks in America, he gives a radio address, a 13-minute radio address, in which he talks about the banking crisis, which essentially the next day, nobody knew it was going to happen. But instead of people rushing to the banks and pulling their money out, people went and put their money back in the banks. essentially ended the banking crisis with one radio broadcast. Nothing had fundamentally changed, but he had this power of persuasion, this confidence, this optimism about the future that was contagious. And I said, how did he do that? How do you do that at a moment of darkness and absolute dejected, broken country, to come in and be able to change the mindset of tens of millions of Americans in one 13-minute radio broadcast? So that's what got me started. And the deeper I dove, the more I realized that his words, everybody knows the famous phrases, nothing to fear but fear itself. We're going to make a new deal for the American people, arsenal of democracy, day which will live in infamy. And those are great lines. But when you really dive into his speeches and you see how he constructed them, how he convinced people, how he made his case over and over and over again, that's, in my mind, what defines his great leadership.
Unbelievable. Does working for a presidential library, we touched on this a little bit, does working for a presidential library make you biased towards the president? Or is there a dark side that starts to reveal itself as you begin to go through these millions and millions of pages and have to weigh a full person and not just the bust sitting there on the wall that the public reveres?
Well, it's a small club. There's only 14 presidential libraries that are part of the National Archives. And they are a remarkable group of people. I love them all, but they come from very different points of view. Some of them are like me. They came from museums, in which case they're content people, they're story people. Some of them have worked their way up through the National Archives, in which case they're archivists. And of course, the archivist feelings are that you don't get personally involved. You don't take a point of view. You simply provide the records. You give historians access. The historians are the ones who are supposed to be doing the analysis. We're just supposed to preserve and protect these documents. So it's very different. Sometimes you get people working for a presidential library where they disagree with the president's policies vehemently. Other times you get them like me, where the content of his character and the nature of his policies were things which inspired me. So I'm a little bit outside the norm. I think most library directors don't get as emotionally connected and go on and write books about their subject matter. But I was inspired, and hey, you know what they say about turning 70? It's the new 40. It's time to figure out what you want to do with your life.
There you go. I love it. I want to hear about your news career before we get back to FDR and Lindbergh. I'm a news broadcaster myself, so I'm curious to hear what journalism experience you had and how you think that translated into writing for a book audience as opposed to for broadcast.
Well, I'll give you the shorthand version because it's a long story. So I was a music major in college, electronic music. And so when I got my master's degree, there was no real jobs for avant-garde electronic musicians. So I started doing sound recording for documentary films, started with sort of nature films on elephant seals and dolphins, and then transitioned to being a video editor at a local TV station in San Francisco, KPIX, the CBS station there. And then sort of climbed the ladder, went from being an editor to associate producer to a producer. Then I was hired to be the coordinating producer for a new nightly half-hour news show based on the newspaper USA Today on TV, which was a very interesting disaster. And then I became the co-executive producer for America's Most Wanted, which was on the fledgling Fox network back then when I was working there. And that really is where I learned the power of television, the power of stories. You tell a compelling story about some terrible crime, you put a guy's picture on the TV and the phones ring off the hook, and half an hour later he's in custody. And
I know that guy.
And then I went on to produce, series for the Learning Channel, for the Discovery Channel, for TBS. And when my daughter was born, I said, you know what, these 100-hour weeks where I'm traveling all over the world doesn't really make for a good father. And so I took a job at the museum in Washington, D.C., where I would be at home at night and could go to their soccer games and, be a father. And the museum, which was dedicated to the history of news, was very media heavy. So I got to do a lot of films and websites and interactive experiences. So that's sort of what prepped me for when I saw the opportunity to become the director of the FDR Library. I said, this is my job.
How did you learn to write in book form as opposed to for broadcast the way we, are used to writing like people talk? How did you train yourself to do a different kind of writing?
Well, I won't pretend it was easy. It was hard. The As a person who writes for someone else to speak, right? The key, if you're going to be successful at that, is having a sense of what that voice is. Then when you're writing for a museum, you're writing exhibits. I wrote exhibit scripts and films for museums. Then you have this very sort of neutral institutional voice, right? You're trying to reflect the voice of that institution. And then when I got to the FDR library, I started doing blog posts and articles. And that's where I started developing my own sort of voice about FDR. But those are short forms. And so the learning process for writing this book was long and challenging. And I had lots of help.
Let's go back to FDR now. When the war began, I love this scene in your book. FDR gets a phone call, 2:50 in the morning. He then immediately just snaps to work, right? Right out of bed, up and at 'em. He notifies government officials, then he notifies media. I'm curious about the media relationship. Can you describe how he cultivated this relationship and why, even in the middle of the night, the administration understands that the media has to be brought into this?
Well, FDR had a really interesting relationship with media, which back then really meant newspapers and radio and magazines, because there was no television, there was no internet. And of course, most of the publishers opposed him and opposed his policies. William Randolph Hearst, McCormick in Chicago, even the New York Times at times was very critical of his actions. However, the reporters who covered him loved him because he was colorful. So FDR had, and I know this is a hard number to believe, almost 1,000 press conferences during his administration. When he first took over,
Biden's up to what? 9, 6? How many,
So when he first came in, he understood that he had to talk to the American public on a regular basis. And so he would have twice weekly press conferences in the Oval Office. They would just open the doors and, 50 or 60 reporters would crowd into the Oval Office. They'd just hover around his desk. He would sit back and lean back and he would talk to them and things would be off the record or on the record. And he would joke with them and he knew all their families, and it was absolutely a radical break from Herbert Hoover, who hated the press, wouldn't talk to him. And so they loved him, and he was always good for copy. He had very strict rules. So if he said he didn't use the phrase off the record, but, background, he would say. And somebody quoted him, that was it. They were out. And there was a rule. I mean, the press was extremely respectful of his privacy. You won't see any newspaper photos showing him in a wheelchair, showing him being carried in and out of the car, showing his withered legs, showing him with the crutches. They just didn't portray that. Now, people knew he had polio. People knew he was, what they called lame or, back then, that he had trouble walking, but very few people understood that he was almost completely paralyzed from the waist down. And the press had a understanding with him that they wouldn't show him. And if a new reporter shows up, a new photographer shows up and tries to take a picture of him being carried out of the limo or getting in and out of a wheelchair, if one of the other photographers didn't knock the camera out of his hands, the Secret Service would come over and take the film.
Wow. The common belief is that Pearl Harbor was the impetus to the U.S. declaration of war on Japan, and that as other Axis nations declared war on the U.S., subsequent to that, the U.S. was then fully drawn in. I'm curious, though, on the night of December 6th, right? So like the day before, where was U.S. public opinion on joining the war, and how did that align with where FDR was on joining these wars?
It's a really great question. And it doesn't have a simple answer because there's two different things going on here. One is that even though American public opinion had been strongly isolationist, say in September 1939 through mid 1941, FDR had chipped away at that and gradually moved public opinion to, number one, to be supportive of providing arms and material to Winston Churchill to keep England alive as they fought Germany. But of course, there was legal restrictions. The Neutrality Act really prevented FDR from doing what he wanted to do. But over time, more and more Americans realized we have to support Great Britain, we have to help the democracies, but we don't want to send any American soldiers over there. So a majority of Americans were still opposed to getting involved with the war, but they wanted to support Britain against Hitler. Japan was a very different thing, although there was a real sense that the Japanese were terrible, the rape of Nanking, all the media about their atrocities. Everybody thought the Japanese were bad, but they didn't really seem to be much of a threat to America. And to be honest, the inherent racism in American society was that, the death of tens of thousands of Asians is not as important as the death of tens of thousands of Europeans. And so nobody wanted to get involved with the Japanese war, and they sort of tolerated FDR's increasing pressure that he was putting on Japan through the sanctions and the elimination of providing oil and things like that. But America really was not anxious to get into this war until Pearl Harbor. And, there was nothing the Japanese could have done more effectively to bring Americans together in a remarkably unified response than the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor.
Describe this amazing moment that he delivers on the dais. He says, "It's a day that will live in infamy." Where did that phrase come from? How did that speech come together? And then how are those words received by the American people?
So you have to remember, December 7th was the worst day in FDR's life. He loved the Navy. He was passionate. He was there when the keel of the Arizona was laid when he was Assistant Secretary of Navy. He knew the captains of many of these ships that were destroyed in Pearl Harbor.
Sorry to cut you off, but did Japan know that going into this attack,
Oh, yes,
that it would strike at his heart?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was well known that he was a Navy buff. And so it's the worst day of his life. And it's the worst defeat in American history. And so he's now in the White House. He finds out around 1:30 in the afternoon. He brings his senior advisors in, brings his military advisors in, has to tell people what's going on. Meanwhile, all day, new telegrams are coming in. They've invaded Guam. They've invaded Singapore. They've invaded, remember, this is a 4,000-mile front with more than 1 million Japanese soldiers landing all across the Pacific. Then he has to bring in the congressional leaders, right? And so in a short gap between when he met with his military leaders about 4:00 in the afternoon and when the congressional leaders were coming in, he calls his assistant, Grace Tully, in. And he says, "Grace, come in. I'm going to give an address to Congress tomorrow. I need you to write this down. It will be short." And Grace talks about this in her autobiography. And he sits there and he leans back in his chair and he takes a drag on a cigarette and blows the smoke up at the ceiling. And then he dictates the entire day of infamy speech off the top of his head, complete with punctuation, without stopping.
Are you sure? Do we know that? I guess we do.
Well, we do know because she has their, she then goes and types it up, brings it back to him, and he carries this around all day, and he's reading it to the different factions who are coming in to be updated on this. And you can see so the first line originally said, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in world history. And in the original reading copy, he crosses out world history and he puts infamy, and he puts a dash before that, and the dash is to indicate to him that he has to take a pause. So we know what that first draft looked like. We have to take Grace's word for it, that she was the only person in the room with him. But it certainly is consistent with a number of other instances where he just comes out with a, completely formed idea, like the Four Freedom speech. The same thing happened with that. So that was the moment where he comes up with this speech.
I assume you've seen this reading copy and potentially held it in your hands. What is that like?
Yes, I've seen it and I've read it. And it's, to be honest, on my first day on the job, it was one of the documents that the staff showed me, as the treasures of the library. And it is, right now I'm getting the hair on my arms just standing up, just remembering that moment, because when I held it, you get this realization of what this document really is. Now, the interesting thing about it is that when he read this speech, and it's short, to his cabinet, Secretary of State Cordell Hull threw a hissy fit, basically saying, no, 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 you can't read that. We've written a 17-page speech for you, which details all of the transgressions and the duplicity of the Japanese imperial government and the emperor, and here's what you have to read. And FDR basically said no. And then later on, Cordell Hull comes back. They have another fight in front of the whole cabinet about this speech. And FDR finally says, all right, give it to me. I'll read it. Remember, 17 pages long. His speech is 3 pages. We know, because we have it, that the library has a copy of that 17-page speech in which there's not a single pencil mark, which means FDR didn't even read it because he had no intention of doing that. He knew what the American public needed to hear. They needed to hear we were attacked. It was a dastardly act. In the end, we are going to win. And that's what he said.
I will tell you, I'm sure I saw it or copies of it when I went there. My favorite artifact, I just couldn't believe looking at his car. You can like look right into it over the top. And I said to my dear great professor Marty Brownstein, we took a trip to the museum together all the way from Ithaca, so it's a few hours. And when we looked at that car, I said, do you believe that his, and I didn't use this word, but his butt was actually in that seat? To me, that was just the moment that just made that museum come to life.
The car is the greatest artifact, and he had several cars over his career as president, and that had these hand controls that enabled him to drive, even though he couldn't use his feet. And that is the Fort Phaeton, 1938 Fort Phaeton, that was custom built essentially by Edsel Ford. By the way, Henry Ford and FDR hated each other with a passion, but Edsel Ford was sort of the go-between. But there's a very famous story about that car, which is that in June of 1939, the King and the Queen of England come to the United States, first time royal visit. This is all part of FDR's plan to try to convince the American public that the British are fine. Back then, the American public was not enthralled with the monarchy. Not like today where everybody goes gaga over the King and the Queen. They hated them. They were still mad at the British for not paying us back for the money we lent them in World War I. Anyway, so the King and Queen, they come, they have the big event in Washington. They go to Mount Vernon, they come up to Hyde Park. They're staying at FDR's mother's house at Springwood, and then they're going to have this picnic, this famous picnic up at Top Cottage. And so FDR drives the King and the Queen and his daughter-in-law, Betsy Cushing, was married to his oldest son, the 4 of them in the car, and they drive up from Eleanor's home, Valkill, up to Top Cottage where this picnic is going to take place. Anyway, FDR was a terrible driver. I mean, not just because it was hand control. He was just a terrible driver.
So is JFK, by the way.
Right. And if you look at that car, next time you go and look at it, you'll see there's a little silver metal can next to the steering wheel. And if you push the button on that can, out pops a lit cigarette. Because FDR used to take both hands off the wheel while he was driving to light his cigarettes. Okay.
I remember the cigarettes. I do remember. It was just 20 years ago, but I do remember the cigarettes. I just couldn't believe it. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So they drive up to Top Cottage. FDR's it's sort of this windy road. He's driving like a lunatic. He gets up there. The Queen gets out of the car. She goes over to the head of security and tells him that they will need to find an alternate means of transportation because the Queen shall not be returning with the president.
That is a very, 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 very good story. How did Charles Lindbergh react to Pearl Harbor? Did he get that the gig was up? The jig was up right away? Or did he say, I'm digging in here?
Well, it's a great question. It's a very interesting moment because he had become the spokesperson for the America First campaign. He had uttered some fairly anti-Semitic remarks at a speech he gave in Des Moines. He says there are 3 forces at work trying to drive America into this war that Americans don't want: the British government, the Roosevelt administration, and Jews. And basically, went on to accuse the Jews because they owned the media of manipulating American public opinion. And so that caused a lot of chaos within the America First Committee. Some of the more moderate members dropped out. The real hardcore Nazis took over. And so the organization itself was really struggling at that moment because it was becoming obvious that they were a mouthpiece for Nazi propaganda. After Pearl Harbor, Lindbergh had resigned his commission during this ongoing war of words between FDR and him, but he offered to, re-enlist. he was good friends with the head of the Army Air Force, General Arnold, and basically he was persona non grata. Nobody would take him in. No, none of the services would take him in. None of the aircraft manufacturers would take him in. You know, and this was one of those sides of FDR which you have to acknowledge. He could be mean and petty and vindictive, and he was all of those things when it came to Lindbergh. And he was quoted, and the source on this is a little shaky, but he was quoted by one senator as telling a group of senators that he was going to clip that young man's wings. But what's interesting here is that finally, Lindbergh, who had become good friends with Henry Ford because of their common belief in support of Germany and isolationist sentiments, that Henry Ford had just built the Willow Run factory, which is a mile-long factory that was going to build these B-24 bombers. And he hires Lindbergh to come in and try to fix the problem. And so Lindbergh does eventually get involved in the war effort. And then, very interestingly, at the end of the war, he goes to the Pacific as a private consultant for the Marines, revamps their fighter bombers, makes them much, much more efficient, and ends up flying 50 combat missions. So, he was in some ways redeemed.
Is it possible that a president, let's say someone as talented as FDR and someone who understood the media the way he did, is it possible that a president could rally the American people in this way anymore? Do those conditions still exist among our electorate?
Well, Winston Churchill famously said that, Americans always come to the right decision after they've tried everything else. And so I think it will require an outside force to bring Americans together. If you look at, George W. Bush after 9/11, if you look at Truman in the Korean War, if you look at what happened with Lincoln in the Civil War, when you have these great crises, leaders emerge, but it requires the American public is, if anything, inert. It's very hard to get them to change the direction. Maybe inert isn't the right word, but it's hard to get them to change direction, right? They're like an oil tanker. It takes a long time for them to turn. And it usually requires something from the outside to make them change their minds. Now, with FDR, obviously, he was perhaps the most persuasive president in American history, and he had been working on them for years, trying to get them to understand the role that America had to play, and they had to abandon their isolationism and embrace the idea that they're a superpower. They're the world's first superpower. In the fractious world we live in today, I think it would be hard, but I think, and it will probably be motivated by a crisis, but I truly believe that there are lessons to be learned in this story about leadership, about how you bring America together, about how you appeal to those better angels, and what America is to the world. We are this beacon. We are the arsenal of democracy, but more importantly, we are the experiment that has succeeded. And the image we have in the world and the role we play, whether we like it or not, we cannot walk away from.
All right. So speaking of those lessons, if FDR were to give advice to people today who are fighting against the contemporary iteration of fascism, what would FDR's advice be to those people?
There's no question, if we're using the example of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that FDR would be 100% in favor of providing weapons and support to Ukraine to defend itself. And it's very similar to what was happening with Churchill when Hitler and the Nazis were bombing London every night and, threatening an invasion, and they'd lost most of their, military hardware in the evacuation from Dunkirk. They didn't have anywhere near the kind of military that would match up, with the Germans. The Germans had something like 100 times as many warplanes as the British did. And they were desperate. They couldn't grow enough food. They couldn't do anything without America providing support to them. And FDR did everything in his power legally, and some things that were questionably legal, to provide that support. And I think FDR would recommend the same thing today. You cannot allow a dictator bully to take over the country a peaceful country through force of arms. And I think that's a core tenet in the NATO alliance, in the United Nations, in what we think of today as our rules-based world.
So often I cover books on this show that pit two people against one another. In this case, it's FDR and Lindbergh. Why do you think that works so well in book form, and why do publishers seem attracted to saying, I want a versus versus a versus?
I think conflict is a part of human nature, and that we like conflict, particularly when the good guy wins, right? That's the complexity of narrative storytelling, is how do you keep the story moving forward? How do you create stakes? What are the stakes here, right? Why do I care about what this person is saying? Why do I care about what this person is doing? And the reason you care is because something of great value is at stake. In this case, democracy itself, freedom itself. And so I think it's funny because the first draft of the book that I wrote, which was even more focused on his words and his speeches, was flat because I didn't have an antagonist. And without that antagonist, it's hard to understand what the meaning of his words are. Well, why is FDR saying this? Well, he's saying this because the most famous person in the world is saying the exact opposite. And he has to make sure that the American public understands what the situation really is.
There is an FDR monument in Washington, but it's not as pronounced as certainly the Washington Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. It's sort of a maze in some ways. I don't know that I've been there in a long, long time. I mean, the other ones, you almost feel like you're always there because they're always pictured. Has this country done enough and memorialized the lessons of FDR in a way that is on par with Lincoln, Jefferson, and Washington, who are his rightful heir, or his rightful companions in history?
Well, FDR was very specific about what he wanted. He wanted a white marble rectangle box, which is what you see at his gravesite in Hyde Park. And there's an identical one outside the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And that's all he wanted. And the one in Hyde Park, it just has his name and Eleanor's name and their date of birth and death. And that's all he wanted. And so, that's what all there was for decades. Then the decision was made to create the FDR Memorial in Washington on the tidal basin. And rather than a large stone edifice that sort of transforms Jefferson and Lincoln to these godlike figures, they thought it was more consistent with FDR's message to create a multi-roomed, even though it's outdoors, experience that tells the story. And it includes not just FDR, but Eleanor and the workers and the soldiers and all the people that were involved in that period. And so it tells a story to keep the history alive rather than create some false deity, in the giant, marble statue towering over your head. I think that was an aesthetic that was very much of the 19th and 20th centuries. And today, I think people are much more interested in understanding the context of that period, of that presidency. And let's face it, Americans are not great at knowing their history. It's an undertaught subject. And so anything you can do to engage them with the story, I think, is more important than having them be awed by a beautiful statue. Don't get me wrong. I love the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials, but FDR would have hated it.
I'm sure you have somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 books in your head that you'd like to write about FDR. I'm curious if you have any ideas to whether this has led you to another book on FDR or somebody else, or if this will be it for you with the books.
Well, it's always hard to say. There's another book that I want to write, and it's I don't want to give it too much away, but the title is The Richest Spy in the World. And it's about Vincent Astor, his good friend, who was the richest man in the world, and some of the absolutely unbelievable exploits he got into at the behest of Franklin Roosevelt.
Paul Sparrow, the author of Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh, and the Battle to Save Democracy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Evan. That was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
I loved it. Check out the book and his website, paulsparrow-fdr.com. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter at PaulMSparrow1. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.